All right, welcome in everyone to another deep dive. Big shout out to all our viewers joining us over on the F1 Blogs YouTube channel. You know, we've been getting a lot of questions and comments lately, and a bunch of you have sent in some really intriguing stuff about a discussion that popped up right here on F1 Blogs. Basically, everybody's trying to wrap their heads around this performance gap we're seeing between Max Verstappen and, well, whoever his teammate happens to be at Red Bull. I mean, they're in the same car, right? But the speed difference, sometimes it's like they're in different leagues. So, today's mission, if you choose to accept it, is to really dissect this whole thing. What is it about Verstappen that allows him to just, I don't know, wring so much more out of that Red Bull machine?
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's on the mind of pretty much every F1 fan. And what's cool is the insights from this F1 Blogs discussion, they offer a really fresh perspective. They go beyond those surface-level assumptions and really dig into the nitty-gritty of what drives performance in modern F1.
For sure. And, you know, the first thing that pops into your head, right, it's kind of the go-to explanation we hear all the time. Is it the car? Is the Red Bull just built for Verstappen style, like a custom-tailored suit made for one specific driver?
Yeah, it's a natural place to start. But here's the thing. That very idea, it was brought up and specifically addressed in the F1 Blogs discussion. And guess what? They basically shot it down. They refuted it. And to understand why, we got to take a step back and look at how these F1 cars are born, you know, the core principles behind their design.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. If it's not about just molding the car to fit a certain driver right out of the gate, what's the name of the game in that initial design phase? What are the engineers aiming for?
The big picture goal. It boils down to efficiency. Think of it as finding that perfect balance, squeezing every ounce of grip out of the car in the corners. We call that downforce. But at the same time, you don't want to be creating too much drag. That's what slows you down on the straights. It's like walking a tightrope. And on top of that, they're striving for what we call a wide operating window. Imagine this. You want the car to perform at its best, no matter the track conditions, the weather, how much it's leaning in the corners, even how bumpy the surface is. It's all about consistency.
So they're not going for a super specialized, super sensitive setup right off the bat. The initial focus is on building a solid foundation, something that can handle different circuits and conditions without falling apart.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And if we take that key takeaway from the F1 Blogs discussion, it becomes pretty clear. Early in the design process, the top priority is hitting those big performance targets, not fine-tuning it to suit the whims of one particular driver. That level of individualization that comes later as the car evolves.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So if the initial design isn't the secret sauce behind Verstappen's dominance, how do we explain that edge he has, especially when his teammates seem to have so much trouble keeping up? Which brings us to Max's role as the team leader and how the car has developed over time.
All right, now we're getting to the heart of it. While the car might not have rolled off the assembly line with Max's name on it, you can't deny his influence on its development. It's been huge. As the lead driver, his feedback, his preferences, they've played a massive role in shaping the aerodynamic and mechanical updates they've made to the car.
Yeah.
And the F1 Blogs folks, they brought up this really interesting idea, the narrow operating window.
A narrow operating window. What's the significance of that?
Picture this. Through years of refinement, guided in part by Verstappen's input, the car might have become incredibly optimized, like super dialed in to perform at its absolute peak. But here's the catch. It might only achieve that peak within a very specific, very tight set of conditions. Imagine it like hitting a bullseye on a dartboard. When everything's in that sweet spot, the car is a rocket. But even a tiny deviation, the smallest nudge in the wrong direction, and it becomes way more difficult to handle.
So it's not that the car was designed specifically for him right from the start, but over time, through his experience, his feedback, he's steered its development towards a very high performance, but maybe less forgiving state. Is that it?
Bingo.
Yeah.
And the discussion on F1 Blogs, they really hammered home the fact that Max has been with this team, with this car lineage, for a long time now. Years. He knows it inside and out, every little quirk, every subtle reaction. He's not just been handed a perfect tool, he's been a part of its evolution every step of the way. The real argument here is that Verstappen has adapted. He's molded himself to this potentially tricky car rather than the other way around.
Okay, that really flips the script. Now let's talk about Sergio Perez. Checo. It's hard to ignore the fact that his performance has been a bit up and down after what seemed like a really promising start at Red Bull. The F1 Blogs discussion brought up some really interesting historical comparisons to give us a bit of perspective.
You're right. This is where we can start to draw some parallels. They dug into F1 history, looking at some of the pairings that really stand out. Alonso with Massa, and Raikkonen at Ferrari, Vettel paired with Raikkonen, even Alonso and Kimi again, but later on.
Yeah.
What's the common thread? It often boils down to this. You've got one driver who just seems to have the knack for extracting the absolute most from a particular car characteristic. And their teammate, even if they're a world-class driver, just can't seem to consistently match that level.
It's like the car is speaking a language and one driver is fluent while the other's still trying to learn the alphabet.
Perfect analogy. And the F1 blog's contributors, they highlighted how a driver's whole perception of the car, and ultimately their performance, can be massively influenced by those inherent traits and the fact that their teammate is making it look easy. And there was this one observation that really stuck out to me.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
They pointed out how Kimi Raikkonen, a world champion no less, sometimes looked, and I'm quoting here, idiota when he was up against Alonso. Now, obviously, Kimi didn't suddenly forget how to drive. It's more about the fact that Alonso's style, his abilities, just clicked with that Ferrari. It made Kimi's efforts seem weak in comparison. And we've seen this pattern throughout F1 history. Top-tier drivers struggling to find their footing in specific car-driver combinations.
It really drives home the point that it's not always a simple case of one driver being flat out better than the other. It's about the synergy or the lack of it between the driver and the car. And sometimes that can be a real wild card. So knowing all this, what kind of a challenge are we talking about for any driver who finds themselves in that second Red Bull seat trying to keep up with Verstappen?
The F1 blog's discussion didn't sugarcoat it. Trying to match Verstappen's pace in that car right now, it's a monumental task for anyone. It's not just about jumping in and expecting to be on the same level. They emphasize the time, the adaptation required. They even suggested that for some drivers, even really talented ones, it could take a lot of races, maybe even the better part of the season, to truly understand and unlock that car the way Max does.
So raw speed, that's just the starting point. There's this massive and very specific learning curve attached to this car, especially in its current form.
Absolutely. And they really highlighted the need for what they called an intelligent driver. It's not enough to just be quick. You need that analytical side, the ability to dissect the car's behavior, understand its quirks, and then adapt your driving style. It's about figuring out what the car wants and then having the skills to deliver that consistently every lap.
It's not just steering and throttle, is it? It goes so much deeper than that.
Exactly. We're talking about the subtle nuances of driving technique, how a driver approaches a corner, the way they hit the brakes, how they manage the throttle, even how they use the curbs to influence the car's rotation. These are tiny details that make a huge difference, and they require a ton of experience and a very finely tuned sensitivity to the car's feedback. Verstappen, he spent years honing those skills in this specific environment. That gives him a huge advantage.
It sounds incredibly demanding, like walking a tightrope at high speed. You nail it, you're flying, you get it even slightly wrong, and you're bleeding time, maybe even ending up in the gravel. And that brings us to another fascinating point that came up in the F1 blog's discussion. The frustration of seeing the data, knowing what needs to be done, but then not being able to translate that into action on the track.
Oh yeah, that's where the real mental battle comes in.
Yeah.
And they use a really cool analogy to illustrate this disconnect between data and execution.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me. What was the comparison?
They talked about trying to perfectly recreate a scene from Pulp Fiction with your buddies. You can watch it 100 times, memorize the lines, understand the timing, the movements, but actually pulling it off with the same finesse as John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson, it's a whole different ballgame. And it's the same in F1. A driver can analyze Verstappen's data until their eyes bleed. They can see exactly when he brakes, when he turns in, how he modulates the throttle. But out on the track, it's like trying to speak a foreign language after just learning a few phrases. You know what you want to say, but it just doesn't come out right.
It's the classic difference between knowing something in your head and actually being able to do it at an elite level. And it sounds like the level of precision in F1 just magnifies that to an insane degree.
For sure. And they really emphasize that Verstappen, he's developed these incredibly refined sensors over years of driving at this level. His hands, his feet, his whole body, they're like finely tuned instruments. He can feel and react to the car in ways that might even be subconscious for him at this point. It's not magic, like they said. It's about gradual adaptation, a deep understanding of the car's language that goes beyond conscious thought.
So it's like he's not just driving the car, he's become part of it, almost like a symbiotic relationship. They've evolved together. Which leads us to a question. What can the engineers do to try and bridge this performance gap to make the car more accessible for a wider range of driving styles?
That's the big challenge, right? Widening that operating window. Ideally, the team wants a car that more drivers can extract performance from. And the F1 blogs discussion, they highlighted two different approaches teams might take in a situation like this.
Okay, I'm curious. What are the two options?
The optimal scenario, the ideal outcome, is collaboration. The faster driver, in this case Max, actively working with his teammate, sharing his knowledge, helping them understand the car's nuances. But they hinted that in a hyper-competitive environment, that level of cooperation might not always be realistic. The alternative is for the other side of the garage to really focus on their own game, understand their limitations with the current setup, and then tailor it to their strengths. It might not match Verstappen's peak performance, but it gives them a more consistent platform to build on.
So it's about finding a setup that allows the second driver to build confidence, to perform closer to their own potential, even if it means sacrificing a little bit of that ultimate lap time.
Exactly. But they also pointed out the mental hurdle for a top driver. Accepting a setup that feels inherently slower than their teammates, that's a tough pill to swallow. And to illustrate this, they used a really relatable analogy.
Okay, hit me with it. What was the comparison this time?
They talked about going to a local festival. And many of the locals have these really specific customs, maybe even some extreme habits that you just can't and shouldn't even try to replicate. To enjoy the festival, to perform at your best, you got to operate within your own comfort zone, your own limits. It's the same in F1. A driver doesn't have to copy Verstappen's exact setup to get the best out of themselves. It's about finding their own rhythm, their own sweet spot, and building from there.
I love that analogy. It's about maximizing your own potential, not trying to be someone you're not. And finally, the F1 blogs discussion shifted to a really crucial role in this whole dynamic: the race engineer.
Right, and they emphasized just how important the psychological aspect of that role has become, especially when you're dealing with elite drivers who are struggling to match their teammate. The race engineer, they're the main point of contact, the support system within this huge team structure.
So it's more than just data and technical feedback now.
Way more. They need to be able to focus the driver's attention, help them filter through the mountains of data, and most importantly, build and maintain their confidence. Show them that they're making progress, even if it's in small steps. The F1 blogs folks, they highlighted that unique bond between a driver and their engineer. It's like a lifeline in the chaos of a race weekend.
It sounds like the race engineer is part coach, part therapist, and part technical wizard, all rolled into one.
Exactly. And they wrapped up by stressing the importance of mental strength. In an environment as demanding as F1, that resilience is essential. It might not always show up in lap times on a given day, but it's what allows a driver to bounce back from setbacks, to adapt, to keep pushing when things get tough.
So as we've seen from this discussion, the performance gap at Red Bull, it's not a simple equation. It's a mix of driver adaptation, car development, and the sheer pressure of performing at the absolute limit in one of the most demanding sports on the planet. It's not about a custom-built car. It's about a driver who's become one with the machine.
Absolutely. It shows you just how complex success is in F1. It's a constant dance between talent and technology, and it's fascinating to watch it unfold.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Huge thanks to everyone for joining us, especially those tuning in on the F1 Blogs YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. We'll catch you in the next one.